Welcome to Beyond the Crime, a psychological analysis, the podcast that dives deep into the minds of offenders and the fascinating field of forensic psychology. Join our hosts, expert psychologists and schema therapists, Shay, Addison, Robert Brockman, and Lars Madsen, as they unravel the complexities of criminal behavior, dissect the psychological factors that drive individuals to offend, and explore the remarkable journey of rehabilitation and transformation.
Welcome to Beyond the Crime, a psychological analysis, a podcast that we've been thinking about trying to create as a way of trying to understand criminal activity, people who have engaged in criminal offending, and trying to make sense of it. And this podcast has actually been a few years in the making. It sort of came from discussions with my friend and colleague Rob Brockman and Shay, Addison, who are co-hosts of the podcast. And it came from being able to sit down and talk a little bit about offences and offending, and how we felt that schema therapy was something that was really useful in terms of being able to make sense of offending behaviour that at the first glance can appear quite inexplicable or confusing and that kind of thing.
And we're all involved in therapy and also the training of something we call schema therapy. We have an online platform called Schema Therapy Training Online, where we engage in training of practitioners in this newer evidence-based approach. But yeah, we kind of realized sitting around, having a beer on different occasions amongst two or three psychologists, just talking about things happening in the media. And with this perspective, it was kind of quite illuminating and interesting. So we've been thinking for a while about it'd be fun to get together, and in some ways, folks can be like a kind of fly on the wall in a kind of lunchroom with a bunch of psychologists thinking about current cases, current topics.
Yeah. And it's also, when I think about my supervision and times that people, what people a lot of the time need help with when they come and bring cases or have issues that they want to talk about, it's usually around this stuff. How do we formulate, or how do we make sense of someone and what's really going on here? And I think there's a lot of value and a lot of nuance and a lot of, I think, art, if you can call it that, to trying to make sense of these things. It's different for different guys, but it's certainly something that is very fascinating and interesting to talk about.
Yeah. So should we say something about, Lars, who are you, mate?
Yeah. I'm a forensic and clinical psychologist and accredited schema therapist and trainer and supervisor. And I've been working in forensic contexts for over 25 years now. And my work has mainly been with violent and sexually violent men, both in institutional and community-based contexts. I found my way to schema therapy a little over 10 years ago, partly because it was a solution to a problem that I was confronting at the time, which was trying to work with guys who were very, very tricky to work with, who would meet the criteria for what will be described as severe personality disorder. And they were very hard to engage, very hard to understand, and they were often very self-sabotaging and problematic within the environments that they were in. And as a practitioner working with them, you had to kind of try to figure out, well, what's going on here, and how do I work with this guy, and how do I figure out what this person might need in terms of helping them on their rehabilitation journey, I guess. And that's kind of where schema therapy became something that I became interested in, because it was something that, compared to the other intervention or conceptualizing models, therapy models that I understood and had been trained in, this was the one that seemed to make implicit sense, both for me and I think also the men that I've worked with. They find it a lot easier to grasp, a lot easier to make sense of themselves, and a lot easier to make sense of why they might do what they do sometimes. So in recent years, that's me. So I've been doing that. I've increasingly done more training in this space, training other forensic and clinical practitioners, and using schema therapy with people in institution and community contexts who might be very, very tricky to engage. And only last week, I was in New Zealand with New Zealand Corrections, delivering some training to them for how to use schema therapy with the men and women who are within their correctional facilities and services.
Beautiful, beautiful. Yeah. I mean, part of that story, Lars, which is cool. I mean, I know that already, but We are, I think we're living in a very special time. Like you said 10 years ago, right? So this has been a big focus of your practice for at least the last 10 years, right?
Yeah.
About how to apply the schema therapy to this kind of violent population or psychopathic kind of populations. And, we're living at a time when we kind of do have like evidence-based options now for folks. I don't think everyone kind of knows that yet, even in our own field. Like it's a kind of exciting time, no?
Absolutely. And I think within the space of working with offenders, I think what we've seen is we've gone, I think, from the 1990s perhaps, where we didn't really know what worked with these guys, to sort of developing group-based programs that help some guys. This is the way we need to go. We need to do these group-based, cognitive behavioral, skills-based programs, and it helps. They do work. They do work with some guys. And I think we've sort of come back around to kind of then starting to realize, well, those group-based programs don't work with everybody. And there's some guys, and some would maybe say like a not an insubstantial portion of individuals who
it might
actually
even be the majority, but
who need something else. And that's, I think, where we've come back to sort of this formulation driven intervention approach with individuals on a one-on-one basis. And that's where, I guess what you're talking about is with schema therapy, that's what that is, which is being able to formulate and engage someone on a one-to-one basis in a way that is going to be effective for that individual. But that might not be the same approach that you would apply to the next person because they themselves are different. But yeah, you're right, Rob. I mean, it is a time where we have got within forensic schema therapy data that now shows that this is a better type of intervention than just treatment as usual.
Yeah. Shay, how about yourself?
Hey, Rob, Lars. Well, look, my story is that I've been a psychologist for a bit over 25 years. And I've always sort of worked in the forensic realm. So I started out as a prison psychologist in Queensland in the 90s, long time ago. And then I worked overseas in the UK at a university in Newcastle up north, and worked on some interesting projects over there where we used the polygraph with sex offender populations and things like that. And then I guess came back to Brizzy and had a private practice for about the last 14 or so years where I worked with Lars. And I guess in my kind of entry into schema therapy was really about when we came back to Brisbane and opened up our clinic, we had lots of referrals from corrections, understandably, and then they have in Queensland this thing called the Dangerous Prisoner Sex Offender legislation. So basically men who have finished their sentence and they have to stay on these long supervision orders. And they're really a very high proportion of them are psychopathic personality disorder. Basically, you're what we might consider treatment fails in the standard scheme of prison treatment. Yep. I guess from my personal journey was that, treatment with violence, people who've committed violence or sexual violence, is not difficult to deliver if the person engages. Like if they're engaging, they want to learn, and that's quite easy to deliver. There's very evidence-based standardized programs, but this particular population of folks is a bit like, Lars and I, kind of talk about it being 3 standard deviations from the mean. It's like it's not your average population. And so we're all like, wow, business as usual does not work with these people. And so for us, that's really a decade ago or so where we started to go, schema therapy, let's get into this. And it just is for us, the more and more that we learned and trained about it and applied it, just the greater confidence I think we had in ourselves as therapists, that I did certainly, to be able to feel like I much better understand this. And you can dance the dance, you can deal with the process in the room and feel like you have a way of understanding really complex people.
So this new approach has really helped you in your practice with these guys. And I guess you're also thinking other people might be interested in that sort of analysis, that sort of depth.
Yeah, definitely. I think it helps explain what is sometimes seems sort of unexplainable, I guess. And I think also with some of the offenders or the clients we work with, it helps them have a way better understanding of themselves. provide the model, mode maps, etc., which, we can get into at some point, is allows them to just really understand what sometimes are really complex behaviors, and it's not obvious as to why someone's doing it. What's the function of that? How does someone end up doing that kind of behavior?
Totally. And this is inexplicable to most of us.
Yeah.
You think, how do you get to a place where that's like, okay? But, I'm guessing for you guys, that's the goal. You want to get to a place where you can understand it, however inexplicable it seems.
Yeah, totally. The greater sort of, research and focus on some of the forensic stuff to do with schema therapy of late has, again, we've really benefited from that in being able to say, hey, this is the stuff that certainly in all of my career seems to be, the best fit for most of the people that I work with these days.
Yeah. And you said something interesting, like, which is a technical thing, but 3 standard deviations from the mean, which means like this is a really small subset of folks, right? That, when you're talking about psychopathic individuals that end up in prison on these kind of orders, these are a very specific sample of folks, but they're also punching well above their weight in terms of their, their interaction with the criminal justice system, the media, the offences, the level of offences that are committed, etc. This is where it's at.
Yeah, absolutely. They're not the guys that we typically work with, and in our kind of, season 1 of our podcast series here that we're going to sort of deal with are not probably your average, person that's just
season
in jail.
1. It sounds like an SVU season or something.
Season 1, episode 1. Yeah. So it's not a lot of the guys that we work with, tend to be, above average in terms of their crimes are not perhaps, the most common. But having said that, they get a lot of media exposure as well because of, I guess, the sensational nature of them as well.
Totally. Okay. So let me introduce myself also. So I'm Rob Brockman. I'm not a forensic psychologist, unlike the two of you. I'm only a clinical psychologist. And I am the director of a small practice in Sydney called Schema Therapy Sydney. It's a small private practice that I run out in Western Sydney. For the past, I trained in the 2000s, so I haven't been around as long as maybe the two of you, but I did get into schema pretty much straight away. I was lucky enough to run into it pretty much straight away and got on my journey immediately, more or less, on my clinical training once it was finished. Like you guys, I was working, I think, at the pointy end but more in the mental health setting, working with a lot of personality disorders, substance abuse, and traumatized individuals. It got to the point working in community mental health at the time. It got to the point where I started to think that everyone had a personality disorder. If you hang out with folks for that, in those kind of populations for so much. So I think there would be a correspondence there, maybe with you guys, if you're working in those kind of pointy end settings. Most of my clients don't tend to be violent. That's, I guess, a big difference between clinical and forensic settings. A lot of the things that you guys will talk about, I know we're going to be talking about things like sex offending and things like paraphilias and, stuff that's often associated with forensic settings. I would tend to see ones that are not 3 standards from the, standard deviations, maybe ones that are like 1.5 standard deviations, or that wouldn't go to prison, or that aren't dangerous but still have a paraphilia, or these kind of things. More recently, probably in the last kind of 5 to 10 years, I've been more and more involved in schema therapy training. So I'm also an accredited schema therapy supervisor and trainer. That's a big part of my work now, sort of running around training different institutions, training up their therapists in the schema therapy approach. And this is where we've come together a little bit, Lars, because I've often been asked to run schema therapy training, basic schema therapy trainings for different institutions, be it in corrections in Australia, forensic mental health in Australia and New Zealand. I'm very proud of this. I've even been asked to run training out at Changi Prison out in Singapore.
Wow.
So I've been around, engaging
That's
with.
extraordinary.
Yeah,
did you get out to Changi Prison?
Totally. Yeah, twice.
Yeah,
I did
wow.
the standard and also the level 2, the advanced training out there.
Oh, that's fantastic.
But it's always, so it's been on my mind from, training up folks like you, forensic therapists, in the approach is a bit of a different thing. The problems they face are nuanced and different to the problems that clinical psychologists face. And so that's where I've always been curious to learn from you, Lars, and thinking about these settings and applying the model in those settings. So I'm a sort of, I would say, not a non-forensic, trained psychologist, but super interested and learning a lot from Lars and Shay, and I think we can have some cool conversations, going deeper, into some of these things that we're seeing in the media.
Absolutely, Rob. Absolutely. I'm really glad to be doing this with you, because I think that you have such great knowledge of schema therapy and a real capacity to kind of problem solve and think about problems in from a schema lens, which is really useful and helpful in this.
I'm a bit obsessed with the model. I'm a bit obsessed with schema. So.
Should we give a bit of an explanation as to what it is? Because
totally, yeah.
Yeah, we're all familiar with it, but perhaps the listeners probably aren't.
So we're all from Australia. We're all practicing in Australia. One of the big, I would say, movements in the training of this and therapists in Australia has been the movement towards getting trained up in trauma-based models. And one of the most popular ones I've seen where there's a need is a model of therapy we call schema therapy. When we say model of therapy, I guess we're saying it's like a style, right? It'd be a bit like, to use a martial arts kind of metaphor, it's a bit like, if you go to do martial arts, they'd say, well, what kind of martial arts? Are you doing karate? Are you doing, MMA, or what is it that you're into? And that style would be conveying a sort of philosophy and a set of behaviors and about the best way to go about things. That's how it is in therapy as well, in psychotherapy. If you talk to therapists, they will have been trained up in various styles. Some get a bit obsessed with one style and go deep into that. Others like to dip their toes into a few different things. So the thing that brings us all together is a sort of passion for schema therapy, this newer approach that's really emerged in the last kind of 15 to 20 years. This has become real popular among therapists in Australia. The evidence that's come out for schema, and that's probably been a big driver for why we got interested. So what is schema therapy? Schema therapy, if you think about it as a bit of a trauma-based approach, it seeks to understand, our problems, the kind of problems, human problems, things that people might bring to a clinic, or it might be other behaviors. It could be substance abuse, could be behaviors akin to things that you guys deal with, in forensic settings, violence, criminal behavior, could be more behaviors associated with things like depression, anxiety, problems in relationships. Okay. So these are very human problems. These are things that we can all, on some level, encounter problems in. So we seek to understand those things using a kind of lens of initially looking at the past, trying to understand how these patterns might have emerged, and particularly trying to understand that through the lens of what we call core emotional needs. Our model suggests that people do things oftentimes because underneath they're dealing with or they're managing emotional pain. When, in this setting, I guess, when somebody rips someone off or they're a con man or something, we would assume underneath that there's a part of them for some reason that feels the need to rip people off, because maybe growing up they didn't get enough, or maybe growing up it was dog eat dog, or, there was no safety, or there was no, nurturance, or that kind of thing. So our model suggests that our, these kinds of problems can be traced back to, our upbringing and different patterns there, particularly around this idea of, whether our needs were met, growing up. And we have a complete model about that, like what the needs are. And you'll hear us talk about that. We'll talk about the need for things like stable attachments, the need for care, the need for guidance, the need for safety. So a lot of the guys you deal with, Lars, I think maybe a lot of the violent behavior can be traced back to the need to feel safe, paradoxically.
Absolutely.
That if I'm scarier than the next guy, then I somehow feel a bit more safe.
Mm.
So these things have patterns, and those patterns have been conceptualized. There are sort of needs that are unmet growing up. And then this can form sort of different patterns of emotional pain that we call schemas, and hence the word schema therapy. So schemas, when this kind of pain is activated. One of the schemas is called, for example, the abandonment schema. And so that means that for folks with an abandonment schema, perhaps they had an unstable childhood where folks were not very stable or accessible, or perhaps that they had a fractured attachment. That abandonment schema might get triggered, these days if their attachments are threatened in some way. And that might trigger a great deal of vulnerability and anxiety. What if my partner leaves me? Or what if I'm all alone? Yeah. So this is the link from the past to the present. Our past themes, our past needs can get triggered off into our daily life these days. It's not just this sort of let's analyze our childhood, but let's understand how those patterns show up in the here and now, how they show up in our life, how they affect our interactions, our relationships, our behaviors. And I guess the last piece, just to really summarize schema, is like the coping part of that. So when those little bits of pain are activated and anxiety around things like abandonment or safety or whether I feel alone or that kind of stuff, folks develop coping mechanisms. In clinical settings, the most common coping mechanisms are things like avoidance. So I stay home. I learn how to detach from my emotions. These kind of things. Maybe I self-soothe. I develop substance use problems to manage the pain, that emotional pain. What would you guys say are the most common sort of coping mechanisms, coping behaviors you see in clients that might find themselves in trouble with the law or in forensic settings?
Well, I would say that almost across the board for the guys that I end up seeing who have engaged in criminal activity, violence, fraud, those types of things is overcompensation modes. So these are modes around, rather than avoidance or detachment, it's around getting on top of situations through intimidation or violence, or using manipulation or control, coercive control. And many of these coping strategies, coping modes as we call them, have emerged in childhood because they were necessary at that time to try to deal with the world, to feel safe, to survive. So I would say unequivocally for a lot of my clients who have had chronic problems in their life with, for instance, violence, this stuff was happening for them when they were 12, 11, 13, 14, where in many cases they were the victim early on. They were exploited or hurt or abused or bullied. And what they learned was that, a way to solve this problem of a lack of safety in my life was to use violence and to be the scariest guy, or to deal with the problem with violence straight away rather than try to talk about it or resolve it, because that just doesn't work.
And let's face it, when you're young, especially, like some problems go away when you use violence.
100%.
It can be very effective.
You get left alone. In an environment that feels scary and unsafe. In fact, if you're the scariest guy in that environment, in a chaotic or dangerous environment, then you're also the guy that maybe has a lot of status. So there's a lot of, psychological incentive to kind of maintain.
You're a fighter, like you're a good fighter. You're known as the guy who can hold his hands up, for example.
You got respect.
There's often a keystone moment, with these guys, Lars, that they can remember the time where they felt powerless, but then they turned the tables and they learned, I don't have to feel like this anymore.
One of, and this is a case that we won't go into detail on today, but one we might go for our next episode, is he describes very clearly this moment where he learned, where it really kind of fell into place for him about the use of violence, and sexual violence in this case, against other men in an institutional setting. That was the kicker in terms of, that scared everybody. And suddenly
right.
he had his moment where he'd gone from feeling weak and powerless and vulnerable to suddenly omnipotent. And he used the word godlike at different times, but that sense of just like suddenly now no one.
You're untouchable. You're untouchable.
I'm untouchable. Yeah.
And that's a hell of a lot better feeling than feeling vulnerable.
Oh yeah, particularly, and vulnerability in forensic contexts and environment. Vulnerability, no matter what you say, get in touch with your feelings and vulnerability. Like The truth is, vulnerability is a red flag. It is basically like a come and get me in a lot of these environments.
Yeah,
If you
right.
show
Oh,
vulnerability,
interesting.
then you can almost get a target on your back, because then it becomes an easy way to elevate your status in a context, in an institutional context or in a forensic context, by being the guy that beats up somebody else or stands over somebody else or something like that. Then dominance hierarchies absolutely exist in these environments, and where you are on it is really, really important. And everyone's aware of them. Maybe not explicitly, but subconsciously, everyone knows where they fit.
This is really interesting, like, because we're all humans. But even just you put like, I notice this with school kids. I mean, whether
Lord
it's
of the
high
Flies.
school, yeah, like these dominance hierarchies. We don't like to say it, but all the kids know. I always, if you're in a high school, let's say with the boys, I reckon this is true. I wonder what you think. We've never had this conversation. I think all the boys kind of know the rankings of who's the toughest kid down to the kid that's the weakest kid physically.
Definitely.
It's like a ranking system, right?
I have a child that's in grade 6.
Johnny has a punch up with Frank and he beats up Frank. Now Johnny ups the rankings, and everyone kind of knows, John, don't mess with Johnny because he can hold his hands up. There is this kind of, no one really talks about it, but this is a thing.
I talk about it with my kids. We've got boys, and able to definitely talk about it because I'm curious about it, about how do they understand their little social world, because it's very much a real thing. And they know, socialized into that, those kinds of things are not the right thing to do. You get into trouble, but it is a definitely inbuilt kind of mechanism of where do you fit and how safe are you according to
system, whether it's popularity or
and you got to think that kids perhaps who might be at the bottom of that, who maybe don't have any other safety mechanism or guidance, end up maybe they develop modes of coping with it, don't they, one way or the other.
Just as a bit of an outsider, like someone who doesn't my everyday life is not working with forensic clients, it was really clear to me, in getting to work with forensic therapists in training them up in some of the schema approaches. These, institutions like prisons and correctional facilities, the clients, you said it before, they're essentially trauma victims, really, basically traumatized people. It was really clear to me we're dealing with a bunch of people that, for the most part, are on the margins of things, and haven't fitted in and haven't had. Wow, to me, it's always felt like they haven't had a real chance. They didn't have
totally.
guidance.
I mean,
didn't have,
people don't turn out to be unbelievably, sort of aggressively psychopathic without having had bad things happen. If they're given, like a stable, nurturing environment that, basically meets their needs, most people don't. That doesn't happen. It's not an excuse for perpetrating violence, but you can't exclude it from the understanding, because it definitely helps you figure out, well, why does somebody behave that way? Why would somebody overcompensate so badly? Because they're triggered. It's proportionate to the degree of triggering.
They don't have a history of stable relationships in the same way that, everyday people might. So
the family systems and every other system, often schooling systems, social systems, have failed. A lot of them, and lots of them have been in juvenile detention or in boys' homes and things like that, which, I mean, when you look at the Royal Commission into those types of management of those places back in the 70s, 80s, those kinds of things, I mean, they're not places where children were put to get their needs met. It actually exacerbated, the neglect that people already experienced. And context is king, which is what Lars and I always say when you work with forensics, and you put someone in a context where they got to fight for their life and their survival. That's exactly what they do. Yeah. It is a case of, those institutions can actually make people worse, not better.
And we say this not to, let people off the hook, but I think if we're really going to understand why these kind of things happen, we have to have this kind of lens. We have to really go into it.
I mean, this is also the nuance of forensic practice, because I think that these environments, it's very easy to kind of flip down the end and say, well, it's all trauma, it's all stress, it's all dysfunction related to this, horrible experiences that the person has had. And almost kind of spend time in therapy focusing on that, thinking that this is going to fix it. But I think this is the thing with schema therapy, is that we can understand that that trauma sits within the individual, and they've had it, and it needs to be addressed and treated in a way that works. But they've also developed these other parts of them, that these coping modes that actually are very, very powerful and often are involved with their criminal activities and their violence and their problems with the criminal justice system, that are what we would call the criminogenic factors that need to be addressed and met head on. And that's where the patient, the offender in therapy kind of needs to be kind of held accountable, saying, yeah, I get this horrible stuff has happened and we can deal with that. But on the other hand, you also have a part of you, a side of you, that uses intimidation and violence to get your needs met when you're blocked. Or
so this is a big
like
part.
You need to con people or manipulate people if if you're not getting your needs met in the way that works.
So this is a big thing we'll talk about, isn't it? That another part of schema therapy, and we're drip feeding ideas here, is the idea of parts. And that is that we human beings aren't really a sort of unitary self or identity. We're not always consistent. A better way to think about people is that they're a sort of a conglomerate of parts. There's a part of us that feels happy. There's a part of us sometimes that feels angry. There's a part of us that wants to be violent. There's a part of us that wants to avoid, all of these kind of things. There's a part of us that wants to be pro-social. This is more the view that we find useful in working clinically with a lot of people, but also more recently with people who are committing offences, seeing it through that parts lens. And that's something that's going to come up time and again in our pod.
I might just circle back a little bit to when, Lars, you're talking about compensating modes that we mentioned, which is very true. But some of the, like the aggressive overcompensating modes, the more overt ones are really, the ones that are in your face, easy to see. Someone's intimidating, someone's threatening, someone's angry. Some of the harder ones to work with, but very common in sexual offenders. We had sort of, the idea, I suppose, of talking about the big case that's in the Queensland press at the moment, which I think is a guy that would definitely would be trying to understand him within that lens. The case of the guy who was a childcare charged with offences against 91 children over a 15-year period, with just like close to 2,000 charges.
Yeah, and this is what's, of course, known. This is what's known.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so when you look at something like that, that's, we think about forensic populations, big, aggressive, sort of angry people. It's not the case. We certainly in our practice where we specialise in sexual offending, there are large numbers of people, and preferential pedophiles, for example, like this chap, who can fly under the radar because they have those overcompensating modes are so well developed. And they're extremely good at deception and manipulation and grooming and appearing as though, grooming parents, grooming kids, grooming everybody. And they can function for long periods of time and offend.
This is quite an extraordinary case. I mean, I would hesitate to say that this is one of, if not the worst case in Australia ever of child sex offending that you can think of. I mean, I'm not...
Just in terms of breadth, in terms of what's been put before the courts?
Well, I mean, what is it? 15-year history.
Yeah, 91 victims across Queensland, New South Wales, and some overseas as well.
Like you said,
at this stage, this is all alleged. Is that right?
Yes, it is all alleged. Correct. Yeah. All prepubescent females, and the man, by all accounts, was a director of a childcare centre, as well as a qualified kindergarten teacher.
So it's pretty much every parent's worst nightmare.
Yeah,
like every single parent's worst nightmare. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
we can all relate to that, right? Because if you have kids,
had children in childcare centres in Brisbane in those age ranges, in those dates. Pretty close to home.
Easily could have been, yeah.
Yeah.
Look, I've got to pick you up on something, Shay.
Yep.
You said before, with my non-forensic background, preferential pedophile.
Preferential pedophile.
Is that right? Did you say that?
Yes.
Can you describe that?
Yeah, well, pedophilia obviously is
So let's start from there. What actually is a pedophile, right? I think we all think we know, but what's the definition, more or less? And then how is this important, this idea of a preferential pedophile?
Yeah, look, but the word pedophile is thrown around a lot, I think, in our parlance in our society. And often, in my experience at least, a lot of people use it incorrectly, or they use the word for anyone who's committed a sex offence against someone who's underage. And that's actually wrong. So there's different kinds of pedophilia, but I mean, essentially pedophilia means somebody has a sexual interest in prepubescent children, right? So not teenagers, but in kids who are yet to develop secondary sex characteristics. And so you can have some, and I mean, I use the word men because, the 99.9% of pedophiles are male. So
is that true? 99.9. Is that what you said?
There's very few female sex offenders, full stop.
Full stop, yeah. Let alone
then once you get onto
pedophiles.
pedophilia, where that's the motivation, it drops.
It drops dramatically. I mean, there's some interesting studies have looked at trying to, and we'll get back to what have looked at sexual interest in children, in prepubescent children within the general population, right? And this is some shocking statistics, I think. And is it about just under 10% of men report a sexual interest or having had a sexual interest or thought about a prepubescent child, and around 4% of women. So 1 in 20 and 1 in 10 within the population. But within custody, the overwhelming majority are men. And female sex offenders are usually, there's very few of them, but they usually are in cahoots with a male, more dominant offender rather than themselves driving it.
In other words, they often would surrender to maybe the male figure or...
So the reason I use men is because that's pretty much, what.
Sorry, I just thought that was interesting.
What we deal with, yeah.
But
so
the preferential
pedophile means that you just have a preference for children, small children. It means you don't have a sexual interest in other people, in adults or any people that age. Whereas you can have men who have pedophilia, so they have a sexual interest in children, but they also have a sexual interest in adults, so they're not preferential.
Yeah.
They can, they have a broader sexual interest, because sexual interest and sexual arousal is a highly complicated sort of topic that is often, it's the research literature in the area is, it's not fantastic. It's hard. It's not well understood. The etiology of pedophilia, like why someone has it, how it's developed, is really poor.
What's your take on this? I mean, you've been working with them quite a lot. What's your experience been? I mean, look, I think this is a good preamble. In our next episode, we're going to cover this case in some depth, but this is a really good sort of preamble to that. If we cover some of this, and we're going to cover also a few more things about, what is overcompensation and things.
Yeah. My clinical experience, Rob, of that, and I mean, I've worked with a lot of men with child sex offending who are not pedophiles and people who are pedophiles. Now, that might be a hard concept for people to believe, but most people who commit child sex offences are in fact not pedophilic. But of the ones who are, in my clinical experience, I guess, is that the onset of exposure to sexual things happens in childhood, early exposure. So by 8 or 9 years of age. So not even, I mean, it's later childhood, but it's even sort of a little bit earlier than that they've got some exposure to, significant sexual kind of stuff. So some of them are victims of abuse, not all of them though, but that they will have exposure to pornography or sexual kind of sexualized stuff. And then it is a process really of reinforcement in that they derive pleasure from it. They're often people that are not, they aren't emotionally, the nurturance around them, or the perhaps the interest in them from the environment is not there maybe to, so they're lonely people that end up, kind of developing a coping mode of that self-soothing, and it feels good. And it's almost like then for some of them that their interests get fixed in time on that point. So as they grow older as boys into teenagers, that interest kind of stays where it was. And then as they grow older into men, it's just fixed there.
So it's just sort of the idea is that the sexual development has been kind of warped in some way, that it hasn't developed normally. It's happened too early. It's been deviant in some way.
Yeah. And then what happens is, obviously, Rob, by the time they get to us, I mean, you're looking at often, I reckon on average, 20 years of reinforcement, biological, neurodevelopmental reinforcement. That's extremely difficult to you know,
reverse.
to reverse. And then you have this kind of fairly fixed, stable
These pathways,
interest. Yeah. And I mean, clinically, that's certainly my experience of men who have preferential pedophilia, and it's just there. And I have clients, some mandated clients in their 70s. So when people talk about, does it ever go away? Can you ever get rid of it? I mean, I've got men in their 70s, and I know when I worked in prison, there were men in there in their 80s, and they still have that.
Going to the grave.
Yeah, so it is, we really kind of understand it once it's been placed for that long. And it's, especially if it's preferential, like you don't have anything else.
No other reinforcement to
shape
go back
it on.
To.
That's just what you're looking at, right? Yeah. And then it's containment really is what we're trying to work with. That's what you're not trying to remove it, you're trying to contain it.
And say something, if you can, guys, for our listeners. This might sound normal to you guys, but I want to play that role if we can on the pod. You said like some, child sex offenders are not pedophile. In fact, quite a lot. Can you explain what that means? So there's those that, of course, like you've explained what actual pedophilia is, preferential pedophilia. What does, a child sex offender look like if they don't happen to have that sort of fit that description?
So a portion of individuals who end up being charged with contact child sex offences who are not pedophilic, who would be individuals who often will present as being quite inadequate socially, have low self-esteem, have lots of really negative experiences socializing with other people. It seems that what these individuals do, these inadequate child molesters, end up kind of pursuing relationships with people who are accessible to them, who are perhaps less threatening to them in some way, who are easier in their mind to be able to socialize with or talk to. And they'll often describe these relationships as being special, that this isn't about sex. It's a special, unique relationship. They will often identify the victim in this case to be someone who, even though they might be a child, they are in fact much more mature, much more capable.
This is how they would describe it.
Yeah.
In a sort of like a cognitive bias or something. Like
absolutely,
distortion.
Absolutely.
Like a distortion that. Yeah, right. Okay.
Yeah, I'm not a child sex offender because that's a horrible thing to do, because who would do that to children? This is what they'll say. But so-and-so is so mature and special. And our relationship...
This is something to get across. Like folks with these kind of modes along the lines of child sex offenders require significant cognitive distortions to allow them to be in that mode. To be able to say things like, I'm not a bad guy, or I don't do these things, or right. So the distortion might say that such and such is mature, a mature person, even though they're not of age. So these are something we call cognitive distortions, and we see that a lot in offenders, right?
Yep.
Yeah, 100%. They sexualize the intimacy too. So you might have a man who's a stepdad who's married and there's kids in the house, and suddenly that relationship's not going so well. He feels, lonely, unhappy in the adult relationship, and they can't fix it, doesn't have the skills or the ability to remedy that, and
feels alone,
suddenly,
feels triggered with a schema.
Feels alone, but the 12-year-old stepdaughter is bubbly and bright, and she makes him feel good. She's happy. She's uncomplicated. She creates good feelings, and then suddenly that's sexualized. The intimacy becomes sexualized, and it's almost like a bit of a proxy partner.
So to be super clear, because I think for a lot of listeners that are not forensically trained, this is an important point. Technically, those people are not pedophiles. They are child sex offenders, meaning that their actual preference, their sexual preferences wouldn't be along the lines of kids. It would be more along the lines of adults, but they have gotten themselves in a position where they've committed an offence against a child.
Correct. But when we go back to this chap in the press, this big case in Queensland at the moment, I mean, clearly this person, I mean, there's a lot of distortions going on there, but there's also to have an extensive offending history like that over that period of time against that many different children, you've got something different going on there. That's not like a proxy relationship. This is somebody who's just getting sexual needs met at the expense of actually really vulnerable kids, because childcare centres, kids under 6 typically, or 6 under 7, kids that literally wouldn't even have a clue what was going on.
So
And you would think for him to be able to do that as well, like there would be an enormous amount of ritualization and planning and preparation to be able to carry out these kinds of offenses, which also speaks to just how powerful and entrenched that kind of fantasy or deviancy actually would be for the individual. If you think how you would be able to sustain this over 15 years, do so in secrecy, more or less, and be able to sustain this front to everybody, ostensibly, obviously, that he has contact with, is quite remarkable in terms of the level of manipulation, conning, deception that you would have to use, but also the determination and motivation that would be driving that is remarkable. So as a therapist, as a schema therapist, starting to work with someone who has this kind of, with this, as I said before, is an extraordinary case. It's tragic. You would already be in your mind thinking that this is an individual that has a very well-developed conning manipulator mode, and perhaps a very well-developed obsessive controller, over-controller mode, we'd call it.
can we I think we need to tie this over until our next pod, and we do a deep dive into this. I think it deserves that.
I think that would be great.
So episode 2 will be, so we're just kind of like working things up here, and then so this is how it's going to roll. Episode 2, we're going to go for a deep dive, and we've explained a lot of the concepts. I just think there's 2 more concepts we have to get through. I think we just have to go back to like, what is overcompensation? So I've talked about things like avoidance. What is overcompensation? And the other one is, Shay, you talked about this thing like we call the healthy adult. So maybe over to you, Lars.
So if we think about different kinds of strategies for dealing with feelings, one way of dealing with negative emotions is to avoid them, to shut them down, to try not to feel them. And people might, block feelings. They might use drugs. They might use distraction. They might use all kinds of manner of things to try to not be aware of or not get in touch with those kinds of feelings. Yep. Overcompensation are strategies that are about getting on the front foot of emotional experiences. So it's the guy in the unit or in a session perhaps who feels vulnerable, and rather than being able to articulate that vulnerability or to be able to communicate about it in a way that's effective, might flip into a very dominating, aggressive mode. We call it a mode, as a way of just taking the power back in the situation, as a way of getting on the front foot of that kind of vulnerability.
Yeah. When you have painful feelings about whatever themes, right? And we have a bunch of them that are common in schema, but let's just take a really basic one I think we can all relate to. If we have some painful, fearful feelings about something like we might fail or we're a failure or something like this, if we were to overcompensate for that feeling, right, or that fear of failure, we would be
getting 4 university degrees.
Yeah. All those things that other people do. Does that make sense, guys? So this is overcompensating. It's kind of partly compensating, like you don't want to be a failure, so we compensate, but also sometimes we overdo it as well. And
Absolutely.
this is how it relates to our offending clients too, right? Because you can imagine deep down there might be schemas about safety. It's really hard for me to feel safe. Like growing up, I never felt safe. But guess what? Now I'm the one that makes things unsafe. Like I'm not scared anymore because I'm the one that should be feared. I'm the one dishing out you know what I mean? Like I'm safe whenever I'm in charge of safety. I'm the safety officer. I make things unsafe for others, right? If they push my boundaries.
Yeah.
So this is overcompensation. I just thought it's worth getting that across. And you've said other things too, Lars. Like we have a word called a conning manipulator mode in schema. That just means it's a kind of coping mechanism, a coping strategy where you become the chess player. You become the one who's manipulating things. You're 7 steps ahead of things, often as a way to stay safe. Shay, what about the healthy adult? You mentioned that mode, that idea of the healthy adult. I don't think the listeners might necessarily understand what we're talking about.
I mean, the way I kind of think about it, I suppose, in schema therapy is that it's really the mode that we're all striving for, right? And certainly when you're working with forensic populations, it's kind of like the antidote to these other modes, these dysfunctional modes or the coping modes. And it's the idea that you kind of say it's a part of you that makes good decisions, takes care of you, gets your needs met in ways that doesn't harm you or doesn't harm anybody else. And so we want to be able to help strengthen that and develop it and make it hopefully the biggest part of people.
Yeah.
And that's their kind of savior in a way. This is the light at the end of the tunnel for a lot of forensic clients in prison. The more you can kind of develop your healthy adult to soothe those difficult feelings and contain your overcompensating modes, then the more functional human being you're going to be, and actually the less risky you're going to be. Because in forensics, right, it's all about risk. You know, it's kind of like we talk about that language a lot because we have to communicate in that language a lot.
So the healthy adult is a bit like a good parent in your mind. It's a bit like that healthy influence to say, okay, part of you might want to be violent and chase the guy or something like that. But there's another part that goes, you know what, that's not going to help the situation. Take a few deep breaths, that kind of thing. Take a few moments. Think about the consequences. This would be, for example, a healthy adult.
Right.
And a lot of your clients struggle with that.
Yes, definitely. No? For sure.
And they haven't had the role models of a healthy adult, by the way, oftentimes.
They haven't. And again, we go back to context is king in forensics, is depending on where the person is situated in the criminal justice system, it's sometimes really hard to find incentives for people to recruit their healthy adult. Because it's even if they want to, and even if it makes sense, sometimes the environment dictates that they just can't get there because it doesn't, it literally isn't safe. So it's really
sometimes
tricky.
It's this. Sometimes, what about the cases where healthy adult just doesn't seem that fun?
Yeah,
or it's just not that powerful.
Boring.
Like it's a lot funner being in charge,
causing chaos.
Or all those things. So.
Yeah, absolutely. It is. It's a little bit like it's boring mum and dad type of deal.
Yeah, this is what you try to sell to your clients.
Yeah, I know.
Very vanilla, healthy. Bring on your healthy adult.
And that's and we'll talk about that dilemma for a lot of folks, because that is the dilemma for me. It is stepping into that world of vanilla, of boring, of mundane.
Maturity sucks, right?
And for a lot of them, then this could activate an inner critic, right? This could activate an inner critic. If you're this vanilla guy, then who are you? What are you?
That's right. Yeah, you're not the life of the party. Who are you, right?
All right, guys. I think that was a really good intro to what we're doing.
I guess the first season we'll be focusing on those kinds of things. So we'll be discussing
your favorite stuff, Lars.
Yeah,
I say that in the nicest way possible. But
what do we have in season 1? We have sexual sadism, exposing paraphilias, child exploitation material, adult rape, pedophilia. Those are the kinds of, I guess, cases that Lars and I deal with.
This is where we're headed, guys. We're going to try to take a deep dive into some of these cases, some of them that'll be in the media, and other cases that maybe Lars or Shay have worked with.
Thanks for listening, and hope you tune in next time. And you can catch our training at
schematherapytrainingonline.com. So if some of this stuff, particularly at this stage, particularly for a practitioner, if you get interested in some of this stuff, we run both basic, foundational, but also more specialized training in schema therapy, such as forensic schema therapy training. So from time to time, we'll talk about that. But otherwise, we hope that you've enjoyed the show.